that, I welcome to the stage Wobi Ofori of 360 Approach. And one of the terms that I picked up in the last panel was minimally viable community. Everybody needs a Wobi in your community, let me tell you, which is a celebratory cheerleader for Houston, and in this case, in hard tech. So over to Wobi.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Good afternoon, everybody. Man, is the energy gone? Come on, good afternoon, everybody. All right, there we go. Welcome to our space and mobility panel. Hasn't this been a fantastic conference so far? And we appreciate you who have stuck it out to this point, and I promise you will not be disappointed. So as some of you know, I am a big fan of hard tech innovation, and with resources like the East End Maker Hub, Greentown Labs, Halliburton Labs, TMC Innovation, and the Houston Spaceport, I am confident that Houston will be known as a global hub for hard tech innovation before the end of the decade. Does anybody agree? No, nobody agrees? All right, very good. All right, so, and I'm confident in that because contrary to Mr. Zuckerberg's vision for humanity's future, humanity does not and will not survive in the metaverse. So we still need hard tech innovation like we've been hearing about so far and we're about to hear about now. So it's only fitting that on the same day that we celebrate the anniversary of JFK's moon speech 60 years ago today, that we close out this last panel with a conversation about the amazing technologies and venture building for applications on land, air, and sea, and space. So now let's introduce our panelists. So our panelists. All right, so our panelists, who are coming up in just a moment, so I'm actually going to introduce them as they're stepping out. Okay, I'm going to tell you about our panelists. So, and then when they come out, I'm going to tell you which one. Okay, so I'm going to start with him. So first, let me introduce Nick Radford. So Nick Radford is CEO of Nauticus Robotics, and he has a background in spaceflight robotics and led the humanoid robotics group at NASA before leaving to found Houston Mechatronics in 2014. Today, they are Nauticus Robotics, a leading robotics as a services company that builds, no way they can do that, robots, and that operate over the horizon of how autonomous work is done on land and at sea. And here's a quick little thing I want you to celebrate with me. Tomorrow, Nauticus will launch from the shores of the NASDAQ Stock Exchange as a publicly traded company. And the ticker symbol is KITT. Please celebrate that with Nick Radford. Coming up on the stage, Tess Hatch is a partner with 111-year-old Bessemer Venture Partners, a Silicon Valley-based VC firm with over $19 billion in assets under management. Tess, herself an aerospace engineer, leads frontier technology investments at Bessemer and applies her tradecraft to building a future where we travel to space with the same frequency that we currently travel in the air. All right, so she's a SpaceX alum, and she now serves on the boards of a handful of drone companies and Rocket Labs, which also recently went public. Also joining me on the stage in the middle, just came up, is Adam Sharkawi. Adam is the founding partner of Material Impact, a Boston-based venture capital firm with one of the coolest names in hard tech investing. Material Impact helps build ventures working on solving large-scale problems of humanity with deep technologies, mostly grounded in material science innovations. Now, Adam has 15 years of experience as a serial entrepreneur and another 15 years in corporate leadership. You would never believe that, you know, those two things add up together. They actually happen simultaneously. That's why he looks so young. And Adam and his partner, Carmichael Roberts, focus on hard tech investments with technological insights that unlock large-scale disruptions in any industry. Now, a fun fact, our event organizer, HX Venture Fund, is a proud investor in Material Impact, and this connected Material Impact to the Houston ecosystem and introduced the opportunity for them to invest in Nauticus Robotics. So congratulations to Nauticus, Material Impact, and HX Venture Fund for Nauticus's public debut tomorrow. At least give it up for them. So I want to let you know the HX Venture Fund thesis, it's working. So finally, I want to introduce our moderator for today. Leading the discussion is Douglas Terrier, Associate Director for Strategy at NASA Johnson Space Center. Now, JSC leads in international human space missions and also focuses on being a catalyst and a support to the entrepreneurial high-tech ecosystem here in the region. And Douglas, he's responsible for ultimately affecting leadership and change throughout the agency. And through JSC's transformative initiative, we applaud JSC's work as they aim to go back to the moon with Artemis and then off to Mars. So it's an exciting lineup today, and there'll be a few questions at the end as well, but for now, just sit up, get psyched, and enjoy the flight. Douglas?
All right, thank you very much, B. And welcome, everyone. I promise you've got a pretty exciting panel ahead of you. These are some of the key influencers in this industry. And by the way, a couple of us were on the field earlier today for the celebration of the 60th anniversary of JFK's iconic speech on the field at the stadium. So let me start by thanking the ION for the air conditioning. This is much, much better. So we'll get right into it. We're going to talk today about probably one of the most, I would say one of the most disruptive areas that are going to influence all industries in the coming decades, and that is everything around transportation and mobility. And we've got with us experts that can speak to every aspect of that, from mobility on land, sea, air and space, for goods as well as for transportation of people. And the first question I'm going to ask, and I'll start with you, Adam. When we think about the biggest barriers in each of those verticals, and maybe you could probably talk more to land, and maybe Tess can jump in on space and air. But what do you think are the biggest barriers as we see the transformation of mobility and transportation, and what kind of technologies are going to be enabling to overcome those barriers?
That's a great question. And first, I want to thank HX Ventures for inviting me to this important conversation and to be a part of such a distinguished panel. So thank you for that. So let's get the party started by maybe even just defining mobility, right? Mobility is, at least from my perspective, simply put, is the flow of people, of goods, and information. And that third one we forget about sometimes, but the information piece, I'm not referring to data. I'm referring to the information in this case, for the purposes of this conversation, that accompanies people and goods, right? So when we think about in the future of mobility, we also think about the information flow that includes identification, security, location, etc. So when we take a look at that, and we take a step back and say, all right, what are some of the challenges in mobility moving forward? And first, we have to recognize that globally, there's a backdrop around urbanization, right? So extremely rapid changes that we're seeing, from the 60s, where we had maybe a third of our population that lived in urban areas, to about a half in early 2000s, projected to 2/3 within the next 12 to 15 years. That's incredible. So that's one backdrop. And then you have all these factors that are, let's say in the last 5 years, that are more acute, that are accentuating the challenges even further. And the first one, I hate to bring up the 8-letter word, but the pandemic, we're all sick and tired of talking about it, but the reality is the pandemic has had a major challenge, right, to mobility as a whole. That's fairly obvious, but no greater industry that really has been impacted than the aviation industry, where we've seen basically a quarter-century gains of RPK, of kind of a measure of passenger traffic, a quarter of a century gains in that whole space wiped out, right? And then you have the fact that the transformation of the focus from passenger flow to goods flow has uncovered a whole array of vulnerabilities in our supply chains. So there's another challenge right there. And then you have the anticipated needs that that come out of that, where we've had to now embrace a last mile delivery for the flow of goods because of the pandemic, to also a great change in the way we think about mass transportation and a focus on micromobility at the level of passengers and the individuals. On top of that, then we have, of course, the Ukraine-Russia crisis, which probably by itself has limited 7 to 8% of air traffic. And, oh, by the way, it's also helped drive the price of petrol, which, of course, impacts every aspect of mobility. And then on top of all that, you have this backdrop of the climate challenge, right? And, transportation, whether it's air or land, whether it's people or goods, collectively combine to form one of the largest culprits of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have, agencies now like the International Air Transportation Committee that is calling for net neutrality by 2050. That's an incredible aspiration. All right, so for being long-winded here, from all that, we take a step back and say, so where are we going with all this? All I would say is, and we'll get into solutions later, but I think that the solutions for challenges in the ground really reside in the air. And I think that we're going to have to embrace the fact that we need to look to the third dimension to unlock gridlock, whether it's passenger or goods flow. And along with that will come many challenges. Some of those may be, not 20 or 30 years away. So given that, I'd love to hear from Tess, who I know is extremely knowledgeable in the subject, and I'm sure she'll have a few things to say about that.
Thanks.
Tess.
Well, I'm going to build off of you and zoom out literally and escape Earth's gravity. I'm punny if I get some laughs. Thanks. And space really is open for business. And there are, to answer your question, 2 technical tailwinds, another pun, that have gotten space to where it is today, that I'll double click on in a second. But I think it's first important to note, where Douglas and I were earlier today, it's the 60th celebration of JFK's announcement that we are going to land the first person on the moon within a decade. And what first needs to happen is that partnership, that platform, and that mission that we have right now with the Artemis program to land the first woman and the first person of color back on the moon. We have NASA and private-public partnerships with amazing companies that will be doing so. So today, we are about to land these people on the moon. How did we get there? What were those technical tailwinds? And there are 2 that have nothing to do with space, but that has gotten space to where it is today, and that's cell phones and metal 3D printing. So double-clicking on the first, on cell phones. Decades of Moore's law exponentially decreased the size and increased the power of cheap commercial off-the-shelf electronics to allow for the invention of the CubeSat. The CubeSat is a tissue-boxed sized satellite that you can throw these cheap sensors on and goes into LEO, a low Earth orbit, whizzing around the Earth every 90 minutes. If y'all saw the movie Gravity, it's where Sandra Bullock and George Clooney hung out. Now, why this is important is before the invention of the CubeSat, the only way to launch something into space, as y'all know well, was a massive school bus-sized satellite that would cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and decades to design, build, test, and launch. And the invention of the CubeSat really lowered the barrier of entry to space. Now, great, we have this CubeSat. We have this ability for students and entrepreneurs to flock to this new form factor, to throw up cameras and communication devices onto this satellite. Moving to number 2, there was an issue. There was no way to get this tiny tissue box into space. Historically, all of the rockets were designed to launch the school bus into geostationary orbit, 36,000 kilometers away. not to where George and Sandra Bullock were hanging out. So the second invention, metal 3D printing, enabled new types of rockets, specifically rocket engines, how the fuel is injected in the combustor, to be developed. That invented new types of rockets, not just SpaceX's Falcon 9, but smaller form factor rockets to take these CubeSats into space. All of this technology is where we're at today. Space really is open for business. And we will land those people on the moon. We will soon get our internet from these constellations of CubeSats, and we'll be able to add many more exciting technologies to this list.
Thank you, Tess. So I'll ask Nick, like we're not to outer space, let's go inner space, subsea and surface sea. Tell us what's unique about that aspect.
Oh, well, it gets thought about very little. Actually, it's something I think about quite a bit. There's a huge disparity between our conversation in the public sphere and on what we're doing in space and what kind of technologies we're going to put up there, right? It's very romantic. And the inner space, the ocean community, it's something that is, in my view, something that's talked about less. And in my opinion, has some of the greatest impacts that we can make coming up. I mean, if you think about 75% of the world's population lives within about 50 kilometers of a shoreline. And so that's an enormous amount of people. And so, as you were talking about earlier, transportation, whether it's goods and people, intersect that boundary regularly. And the ocean space is something that sees arguably very little funding compared to the alternatives. And so that's kind of near and dear to my heart. And I think some of the barriers in this industry is kind of playing up and being relevant. I mean, I think the ocean space is going to be the epicenter in the fight against climate change. That 75% of the world's population that lives that close to the shoreline are going to have a little bit to deal with rising sea levels. So these problems are coming in a hurry. In terms of pushing goods around the globe, as you mentioned, shipping is a big deal in terms of emissions, right? 3% of all global emissions come from shipping. That's going to triple by 2050. So these are some serious issues. They're enormous problems, and they should attract significant investment. But it always seems to be, whether it's the very hardware type of focus in this industry, it always seems to be a very tough conversation to solve those enormous challenges.
Well, let me continue on that thread. What would you advise anybody that's seeking to invest in the industry? What, as a person who has spent some time seeking investment, what would you advise investors that you've learned in the last 10 years?
I think to get back to our roots, the VC industry really grew out of, a post-World War II hardware-intense focus. In order to do some big things in this world, we're going to have to build some big things. I mean, mobility by nature is very hardware-focused, right? The changes that we're trying to make, whether it's the new electric aircraft that might be taking off vertically, all the way to the new cars that are coming out. I mean, these are very hardware-centric problems. Now, what you're seeing is this dichotomy that you have to combine these rather hardware morphologies with very intelligent platforms, software platforms. And what the investor ends up doing, unfortunately, is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you look at the $167 billion worth of VC money deployed in 2019, 60% of it went to software companies. 32% of the rest of that went to healthcare, finance, consumer-facing. 8% of it went to industrial technologies. Industrial technologies, which are the cornerstone of changing the conversation of mobility. So I think investors really need to take a hard look at the amount of capital that needs to be deployed specifically in this sector to really make an appreciable difference.
I think that's a really, really important point. I've noticed that we tend to think of mobility transportation as a hardware-rich problem, and it is. But you made the point in your opening, Adam, that's it's increasingly reliant on machine intelligence and offboard comm and perhaps space enabling and so on. So, one of the things I observe is that if you think about transportation, you could be building carriages in the Roman era to the horse and buggy era, and the technology kind of stayed the same for a couple thousand years. Then it gets into, you better know about internal combustion engines, and that gets you pretty much at the front of the pack for about 100 years. but then it becomes onboard entertainment, self-driving software, and the rate of turnover on that is incredible, right? So can you expand on your thought about how you think those technologies are enabling?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's a great point you just made. And the rate at which we are seeing change in transport is just, really, we're seeing this take off exponentially. So let's take a step back and recognize that for a minute. It wasn't more than a century or so ago that we learned to fly. And then we learned to fly faster, and we learned to fly farther, and then we democratized the access where everybody can fly. That's amazing. That's amazing. So when you take a look at that, I think we can appreciate that, Isaac Asimov's vision or Gene Roddenberry's vision of the flying cars that we all were hoping to see by now, I think are not too distant in the future. And we may have a healthy debate about that topic between Tess and I, but at the end of the day, we are seeing incredible change. What we need to see to accelerate and enable that change, in my opinion, are the following. Number one is, obviously, from energy sources, we need to have battery materials that drive higher density to weight ratios. We need alternative propulsion mechanisms that are beyond the blade drone types of propulsion. So that's kind of on the propulsion side. We need to have sensors that are going to allow us to have everything from collision avoidance to geofencing. Humans are, unless you're an elite athlete, aren't very good at thinking in 4D, right? Three-dimensional and then time as well, and trajectories. We're not good at that. So all that is basically what you were referring to earlier in terms of the smarts and the software behind, right, the hardware. We need to see care and maintenance type of programs and technologies that are well beyond what we have embedded in traditional automotive, because something goes wrong in the air, you're not going to be able to kind of park on the side of the road and fix it. So that's another aspect. And then finally, we need mobility as a service mentality, where we're not just thinking about any one segment, but we're thinking about mobility from point A to point B across the entire spectrum for an individual. So maybe it's an e-bike from A to B, and then it's the eVTOL flight, and then it's the ride share, but it has to go from point A to point B all in one platform. These are the kinds of technologies I think are going to be required to enable the future of mobility.
Thank you, Adam. So, Nick, I'm going to test your ability to be like a science fiction writer here. So, following on Adam's comments, but what if you were to, best guess, like you were to try to describe or paint a picture of what mobility transportation looks like in, 50 years, what would you say?
Wow. You should have given that ahead of time. Let's see. I think there's some sorry guys. I think there's some weather vanes that are starting to point in the direction that some things that we might be able to anticipate. This as a service approach. I wonder for automotive companies what the future of the big automotive companies look like when it becomes less important, the branding. And when the Uber shows up and it's branded Uber, where did Uber get their car from, right? And so I think there's going to be an interesting intersection between the manufacturing side of this, automotive companies that want to be known as automotive manufacturers, but then lose the entire brand of their car because it gets pulled up into the as a service and their logo's not on the car anymore. So I think you're going to see things that head in that direction. You can already see it with cell phones, right? Sometimes you don't even know who made the Google phone. It's just the Google phone, right? The electronics provider is obscured. So, but I think getting a little bit more of the science fiction-y, something that's close to me is if we're headed towards a sea level rise, I wonder I wonder why, if we have so many people that live close to the shoreline, we could start thinking about how to be bimodal. Why don't our cities kind of just pour into the sea a little bit? Why can't we adapt to have obviously the shore side and the subsea? Why aren't we talking about instead of 75% of the world's population within 50 kilometers, why aren't we talking about that 30% also live 10 kilometers out? I mean, I think we need to start thinking in those directions. I'm not going to try to be Jules Verne or anything, but humans are incredibly well at adapting. We know this problem's coming, and being able to imagine a day where the city landscape or the cityscape could plunge into the ocean, and maybe there's no difference.
That's a great vision.
That's the best I could come up with without having that question ahead of time.
Spot, right? So Tess, you've had some experience with disruption. You and I are both familiar in the space industry with private investment, private sector startups. And what do you think are some of the areas in mobility and transportation that are just ripe for disruption by startups, by just kind of outsiders, if you will? And I think that would be of interest to potential investors. What are the SpaceXs of the transportation? Obviously, that's one for space, but.
If okay, I think I'm going to marry those last two questions and sort of answer the in 100 years, where will space
please
be?
do. Yeah.
Because I want to take off my investor hat for a second and put on my aerospace engineer hat, and then I'll answer, because from an investor perspective, I look 3 to 5 years out, which isn't as exciting as 100 years out.
Good.
100 years out, I really do imagine a future where we are traveling to space with the frequency in which we currently travel in an aircraft. And we saw a dozen of those last year. We saw a handful of billionaires taking selfies in space, which was really exciting for the industry. But I really do imagine this future, and it's not to give up on Earth. We do fundamentally need to be a multi-planet species in order to survive, because the technology needed to get to and sustain life elsewhere will ultimately fix and solve the issues that we're facing here. For example, one of my favorite examples is MRI and CT scanning technology. It was actually developed from the Apollo mission. When we landed astronauts on the lunar surface, we wanted to take selfies, and that optic technology created life-saving MRI and CT in hospitals. Laser eye surgery, implantable heart monitors, water purification systems. The list is endless. I'm sure you could contribute more to this list of wonderful Earth-saving technology that was developed via space exploration. So in 100 years, we will have colonies on Moon and Mars and some other thing we haven't even thought of today. Now, taking off my aerospace engineer hat and putting on my investor hat, who is a venture capitalist that looks for a large return in a very short period of time, what are those more near-term, exciting, disruptive technologies from a space perspective? 5 to 10 years ago, it was launch. It was rockets. It was making that elevator, establishing a better transportation. We have over 300, and the joke word is fantasy launch vehicle companies that have yet to launch or are trying to launch. So we're good on launch. The next one was utilizing that CubeSat form factor and throwing up sensors like your cell phone, taking photos of the Earth and communicating with the Earth. We've got lots of companies in those two spaces as well. So what's next? And it's entrepreneurs and students coming up with unique, novel sensors in low Earth orbit. Not taking photos of Earth, not communicating with Earth, and not launching the CubeSats, but new, unique sensors in LEO, low Earth orbit, or on the Moon that benefits Earth or benefits space. I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't know what they are. But I'd love to learn from y'all.
Great. Thank you very much, Tess. That I'm going to throw it back to you. And as a venture capitalist, what advice would you give to somebody in an early stage founding a company in this space? Tell what you've learned in your course of your investing.
Sure, and maybe I'll tailor it to the Houston ecosystem. So first of all, again, just I always like to put things into perspective. Where are we at today? 100,000 commercial flights, 10 million passengers, $20 billion worth of goods transported daily. Those are amazing numbers. So we're talking, and then if you look at the projected CAGR on top of that for the next 12, 15 years, it makes these numbers really meaningful. So why am I saying that? Because here in Houston, have all the ingredients. They're all the ingredients to work on these big problems. We're talking about technologies that pertain to transportation, particularly air and space, Houston. Energy and propulsion mechanisms, Houston. I mean, oh my God. So my advice is, this is an opportunity for all of you entrepreneurs who are really interested in making an impact to really look at this space. And you have all the right ingredients in this ecosystem. Be bold, help spin out technologies from universities like Rice, from the panels that we discussed earlier. And then when you develop these big, bold solutions to these big problems, please come to Tess and me and let us help you build it. That's my advice.
All right, great. I wanted to ask one challenging question. So something that's where everybody thinks of mobility, transportation, it's electric vehicles, electric VTOL vehicles, and so on. So I'd just like to hear from each of you. What do you think? I think one of the difficulties that we don't talk about a lot is if we look at the entire system, right? The supply side, California, the grid. Great technology, great potential, but we have to work the problem all the way back to where does the energy come from, right? And what are your thoughts on that? I'll start with you, Adam, and just give everybody a quick answer. Because ultimately it's about sustainability on a global sense, right?
Yep, so great question. Real quickly, high level, urban air mobility, air taxis, that's I think Tess and I would agree, that's 20, 30, 50 years out. We have to look at important verticals that have a here and now value proposition where you're not trying to go against a commoditized low margin business like ground transport. So first response, emergency, transport, those are high margin type of opportunities where the eVTOL business can make an impact with the current infrastructure, current battery technology, current types of propulsion mechanisms.
Excellent. Yeah. Nick, thoughts?
Well, I think the capital, our industries have a way of working these things out, right? I mean, the markets move on kind of three basic forces: technological, economic, and the social, right? And so I think for the first time we have tremendous social pressure to really be looking at how we do this energy transition. Technologically, it's vibrant, right? It's a beautiful world. There's things coming out faster than you can keep up with. And economically, there's tremendous pressures to make things always ever cheaper, right? And so I feel like the free market economy is going to burst these things out. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys fund and how I'm going to be getting home in the future.
Great. And Tess, what about your thoughts?
I'm going to be a bit controversial.
All right, I expect no less.
Finally.
We will have an Uber pick me up from this conference and take me to the airport right now autonomously. We will have drones deliver us our late night pizza. We will fly in flying cars. I'll take back the first one. I'll take a flying car to avoid Houston traffic. I heard it's bad right now. We will travel to space. The friction is the speed of technology versus where regulation is at. And hey, regulation keeps us safe, but it's been written a long time ago.
Great. All right, well, thank you all very much. I'm going to give, we've had quite a few questions come in from the audience, so I'd like to try a couple of these. And let me start with Adam, since it's kind of along the lines of what you brought up earlier. Do you believe that augmented reality is an inevitable integration into navigation and transportation? And I think I know what the answer is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think that we, as I mentioned earlier, human reflexes in and of themselves are not going to be sufficient to deal with 4D information. And I think that with the kinds of sensing that are currently being developed for AR, VR are going to be very seminal in terms of the integration of autonomous, navigation. So, the short of the long is absolutely.
Yeah. Tess, I wonder if you'd weigh in on this, especially with off-board information and navigation, et cetera, intelligence even coming from space. I think that's an integral part of the network, right?
What Adam said.
Let Adam talk about it? All right. Yeah, tell me about that.
Sorry,
Wow.
AR in space?
I'm just talking about not augmenting reality, but just continuing that theme with information, navigation, off-board intelligence being from space into the transportation system.
Tell me if I'm not answering your question, but I think it's interesting that SpaceX's capsule is completely autonomous. There's one big red button if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
Versus shuttle, Apollo, astronauts were doing everything.
Agree. Okay. So Nick, let me turn this one to you. What will be the turning point when we will have to stop adding new stuff into space because it's become too crowded with junk and risky for human flight? So I figure you, being a former NASA guy, you could take that one.
At what point?
Yeah.
I think we're getting pretty close. There's you Google the amount of space junk floating around out there. It's micrometeorite impacts are a fairly big deal, right? We think about them, and but I don't know. That's a hard question, Douglas.
Maybe I'll help out a bit.
I'll jump in as well.
This is an incredibly polarizing topic in the space industry. Some people think that space junk is such a huge issue. It's going to be the reason space is unusable. We have these space debris clouds already from the Russian military recently when Russian cosmonauts were on the ISS. It's heartbreaking. We've caused a few, China's caused a few, etc. The other end of the space industry, space is big. There's lots of space in space. And if we physically track it and track the radio frequency spectrum in which satellites are communicating over, we won't hit each other or we won't interfere with one another. Like when you dial the radio station and you're in between two radios, imagine if that happens to one of our satellites. So where we're at right now is commercial companies are being good Samaritans. They're being good citizens of our space, and they're working on when their satellite is defunct, they get out of their orbit and burn up upon reentry to keep our space usable. But we really can't have governments or people having these satellite blow-up tests that are causing these fragments of debris. Imagine these debris, even a chip of paint is flying at 17,000 miles per hour, and if it hits the International Space Station, there's souls on board. So we have to continue to be good Samaritans, we have to continue to treat space well, but at the moment I don't think it's a massive issue.
And I'll maybe, if you don't mind, Tess, I'll add on that. I think that I don't think it's far-fetched to think that we will have regulation that requires basically anything that goes up has to be able to come back down safely. We're already seeing a lot of electric Hall effect thrusters that are being integrated into satellites that are being put up that require them to be able to have enough reservoir to be able to bring them back down before they get launched. So in my mind, I don't think it's going to be much contention. I think it's going to be a requirement fairly soon.
While you have the floor, Adam, I think this next question is kind of right up your alley. What advice do you have to materials-focused entrepreneurs seeking early-stage venture funding?
Well, I'm a little biased.
I would guess so.
I think we believe that materials are the DNA and the genomics that unlock all innovation. And, it takes the form in different, it's not like it has to be hardcore. It's not like there's a group of people in a lab somewhere stirring up a vat of new materials, right? The reality is that we are uncovering how to engineer new material properties. These properties then start to unlock completely new theorems and laws of physics, right? Just like we went from non-Newtonian or Newtonian to non-Newtonian and quantum. So at the end of the day, I think the future of a lot of the things that are going to unlock these major disruptive innovations will rely in the DNA of materials innovations that will allow for new engineering solutions. So to answer your question, to come back full circle, I highly advise you who have that bent not to be discouraged by the fact that it seems like it's a platform and it seems like it. No, no, no. I believe that as long as you're able to take the interest that you have and basically steer it into, you know, one or two or three clearly defined problems, that is going to be a set of platforms that unlock the next set of disruptions.
Thank you. So this will probably be our last question. I'll give Nick and Tess both a chance to weigh in on this. So specifically to Houston, right? I think we talked about during the conversation, we've got space. We certainly have a transformative energy, which is going to be enabling for all this. We've got the ship channel and the port of Houston. So we're kind of right in the middle of this in Houston. The question is, the industry is experiencing a revolution, and specifically space, but I think you could add all the transportation sectors to that. What jobs do you foresee being created here locally? And what advice would you give to people who want to get into, you know, those kind of careers? Nick?
Well, I think that we're going to continue shipping significant amounts of goods through the ocean. Houston obviously has an enormous port. There's 800 major ports worldwide. I forget where Houston ranks exactly, but it's 6th, 7th, 8th, something on that order. I think we're going to have to also. We've seen some breakdowns of trying to get the supply chain in and out of ports. I think that ports are some of the major bottlenecks that could really use some of the innovations we're talking about. If we're gonna expand the flow of goods, like we think, like again, tripling the amount of shipped goods over the next 30 years, that's the estimate. That's about 10 billion tons. That's significant. We do not have the infrastructure that can support that right now. And I think that it's sorely overdue to really have a hard look taken at this. And I think from that, I mean, technology over time tends to be accretive to jobs. And there's plenty of examples. I mean, a lot of people are always afraid of the automation and the autonomous systems coming in and removing jobs. But technology has been shown over time to really be a boost to employment. Now, there is mobility within jobs. I mean, they do change, but overall it tends to add. So I think things are going to be centered around the Houston port. I would love to see that kind of investment. I mean, it's going to be center stage on the transport of goods, in my opinion.
Very good. So Tess, you're from, the Bay Area, Palo Alto region has long been known as like the innovation entrepreneurial capital, right? So that's one of the things that Houston is very keen on growing from what has been primarily an energy, hardware-rich environment more into a high-tech environment, right? So with regard to transportation and particularly space, obviously being one of them, you know quite a bit about. Your thoughts about where are the opportunities career-wise? What would you advise people who want to get into this sector here locally?
I was originally going to answer it by saying study computer science or engineering. And I'm going to double click on that. Why the Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley is Stanford University in proximity with San Francisco and the space in between. Right down the road, there's Rice University. Right down the road, there's Johnson, which you run. There's these amazing institutions, literally from theory to reality, from academia to industry. And it's ideally Houston can bridge that gap.
Very good.
Can I add to that real quick?
Please do.
So just a few numbers again. By 2030, air transportation projected to be a $115 billion business, split almost equally between passenger and goods. Expected to contribute $30 billion worth of jobs. Expected to contribute several $1 trillion into the GDP. Again, I'll make a plea. Houston, this is an opportunity to focus in an area that could be the epicenter of that revolution.
Excellent. That's a great place for us to end the conversation. And I know at Johnson Space Center, we are very much focused on what our role looks like going forward. We want Houston to continue to be the hub of space transportation and exploration. And I think with, thanks for your advice, and I think with the energy we have in the room, we will see Houston remain as the hub of the transportation mobility sector. Thank you very much for your time.
What an amazing panel, and just want to say very quick words of thanks. Tess, you're a freaking rock star. Thank you for coming all the way and joining us here in Houston. Nick, tomorrow, most excited. The first thing I'm going to think about in the morning, I'm going to look up the ticker symbol. Cannot wait to see that. Adam, a conversation with Adam is like its own space transportation. I always learn, and the other thing I just learned today is apparently Adam's moving to Houston because I haven't met him better. I'm just spreading the rumor, but he's a fantastic advocate. Douglas, such a pleasure to have you represent all the technologies going on at Johnson Space Center here in Houston, and the convergence of our out-of-town venture experts with the kind of entrepreneurship and ecosystem support we have here. It's just the perfect panel to end things.